The fortifications rose from the desert like a warning. Stone walls, 15 feet high, built by an empire that had engineered wonders for 3 centuries. Babylon Fortress was not simply a military position. It was a declaration. This land is not yours. This empire belongs to Rome. And beyond those walls lay something even greater. Alexandria, the jewel of the Mediterranean, a city that had survived pharaohs, Macedonians, and the entire weight of Byzantine imperial power. Yet in the year 640, a Muslim force was advancing toward this fortress. Not a vast army, not an overwhelming force. A determined group of soldiers moving across terrain where every supply line was stretched thin, every reinforcement uncertain, every calculation was a wager against impossible odds. At the center of this campaign was a man who had once been an enemy of everything he now commanded for. His name was Amr ibn al-Az, and his greatest weapon was not his sword. It was something far more dangerous, the ability to see what others could not, opportunity hiding inside apparent defeat. The question that drives this story is not whether he won, it is how. How did one commander, operating from a position of strategic disadvantage, permanently alter the destiny of an entire civilization? The answer reveals far more than a military victory. It reveals something about strategy, leadership, and the kinds of men who change history when the outcome is still uncertain. The world before the general. In the ancient world, a man's origins determined his options. In Mecca, at the beginning of the 7th century, the possibilities were narrower still. The city was not yet the global center of Islam it would become. It was a trading hub, a place where tribal politics and commercial ambition intersected. The Quraysh, the dominant tribe, controlled access to the caravan routes. They held power through commerce, tradition, and a willingness to use both as weapons. Amr ibn al-Az was born into this world around 583 CE, though early Islamic sources do not agree on the exact date. His father, Al-Az ibn Wail, was a merchant and a political figure of some prominence among the Quraysh. This meant Amr inherited not wealth alone, but something more valuable in that world. Access. Access to information, to influence, to the networks that mattered. Early historians describe Amr as intelligent, quick-witted, and unusually skilled at understanding people. These were not merely personal traits. They were survival skills in a society where a man's reputation was his fortune. A merchant needed to read other merchants. A politician needed to recognize shifting alliances before they shifted too far. Amr appears to have been exceptional at both. What we know of his pre-Islamic life comes primarily from later Islamic sources, written generations after his death. We must move carefully here. These accounts tell us that Amr was active in Meccan politics and trade. They suggest he was involved in regional conflicts. Some sources claim he participated in military campaigns before his conversion, but the details are sparse, and historians rightfully caution against treating every narrative as established fact. What does seem clear, supported by multiple sources, is that Amr ibn al-Az was not a marginal figure in Mecca. He was a man of consequence. He understood power. He understood how to operate within systems, and crucially, he understood how to shift his position when circumstances demanded it. This last quality would define his entire life. The moment of transformation. The rise of Muhammad and the spread of Islam disrupted everything Amr ibn al-Az had built. The traditional order of Mecca, the tribal hierarchy, the commercial networks, the religious certainties, was challenged by a prophet who claimed to speak for God and demanded nothing less than complete restructuring of society. The early Muslims were not initially powerful. they were a minority facing considerable hostility. Many of Mecca's elite, including members of the Quraysh leadership, saw Islam as a threat to their interests. Amr ibn al-As was positioned among them. His family had reasons to resist. His position depended on the old system. Yet Amr did something unexpected. At some point, the exact timing is debated among historians, though most sources place it around 629 or 630 CE, near the time of Islam's final victory in Mecca. He converted to Islam.
This was not a private spiritual revelation described in historical sources. We have no account of his inner thoughts, no record of conversations with the Prophet Muhammad, no documented mystical experience. What we have instead is the observable fact. A powerful Meccan merchant and politician shifted his allegiance at a moment when doing so was politically astute, but not inevitable. Some historical accounts suggest that Amr came to the Prophet asking to be taught Islam. Other sources indicate he was among those who converted as Muhammad's power became undeniable. The sources do not allow us to know with certainty which narrative is correct. But what matters historically is not the moment of his conversion, it is what happened after. Amr ibn al-As was not a reluctant ally or a late follower. Within a short time, he became one of the Prophet Muhammad's trusted commanders. He was given leadership responsibilities. He was dispatched on important missions. The man who had operated within the Quraysh's political hierarchy now operated within the Prophet's circle. This transformation, from opponent to ally to commander, suggests something important about Amr. He was supremely adaptable. When circumstances changed, he changed with them. When the power structure shifted, he positioned himself to remain consequential. This was not cynicism alone. It was political intelligence. It was the ability to recognize when the world had fundamentally changed and to act accordingly. Why Egypt mattered. To understand why Amr ibn al-As was selected to lead a campaign into Egypt, we must first understand why Egypt mattered at all to the emerging Islamic state. Egypt was not a distant, peripheral territory. It was one of the most strategically important regions in the Mediterranean world. For 3,000 years, empires had fought for control of it. The Nile River made Egypt impossibly valuable. The river flooded predictably, depositing rich soil across the floodplain. This meant agriculture on a scale unmatched anywhere else in the Mediterranean region. Egypt could feed itself. Egypt could feed others. Whoever controlled Egypt controlled one of the world's primary food sources. Alexandria, Egypt's greatest city, was far more than a port. It was a center of intellectual achievement, a repository of classical learning, a hub of Mediterranean trade. The Library of Alexandria, while it had suffered damage over the centuries, still contained knowledge and texts that existed nowhere else. The city was cosmopolitan in ways most Mediterranean cities were not. It was the second city of the Byzantine Empire, a center of Christian intellectual life and political authority. Beyond the agricultural wealth and the intellectual prestige, Egypt represented a strategic position that any power controlling the Mediterranean had to possess. The Byzantine Empire, which was then the dominant Christian power controlling North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, understood this perfectly. Egypt was not a province they could afford to lose. But by 640, the Byzantine Empire was weakening. The long series of wars between Byzantium and Persia, ending just years earlier, had exhausted both powers. Egypt was held by a Byzantine garrison and administered by Byzantine officials, but the imperial grip was looser than it had been. The cost of defending distant provinces was becoming unsustainable.
This weakness would prove consequential. For the early Islamic state, Egypt represented something different. It was an opportunity. The Prophet Muhammad had died in 632 CE. His immediate successor, the Caliph Abu Bakr, had consolidated power over Arabia. The next caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab, was in the early years of his rule. The Islamic State was still young, still defining its borders, still uncertain of its ultimate reach. The notion that this young state would attempt to conquer Egypt, one of the richest, most defended territories in the known world, seems almost inexplicable from a purely strategic perspective. By all rational calculation, the risk vastly outweighed the likely reward. The Islamic State had limited naval power. Egypt was defended by a professional Byzantine military. The distances were vast. Reinforcements would be difficult to coordinate. Yet by 640, the decision had been made. The campaign would proceed, and the man selected to lead it was Amr ibn al-As. The commander's authority. The relationship between Amr ibn al-As and Umar ibn al-Khattab is crucial to understanding why this campaign happened at all. Umar was a formidable figure, intelligent, decisive, and known for his harsh judgment and absolute commitment to Islam. He was not easily convinced. He did not favor the incompetent or the unproven. That Umar selected Amr to lead what was potentially a catastrophic military venture speaks to Amr's reputation at that moment.
What did Amr ibn al-As possess that made him the right choice for an impossible task? First, military experience. Before Islam, Amr had participated in military campaigns and conflicts. He understood warfare. He understood how armies moved. He understood terrain and supply. Second, intelligence. Multiple sources describe him as politically intelligent and strategically thoughtful. He was not rash. He did not charge forward without calculation. Third, adaptability. He had already demonstrated, through his own conversion and rise, an ability to read situations, understand power, and position himself strategically. Fourth, knowledge of Egypt and the Mediterranean. As a merchant and a political figure in Mecca, Amr would have had access to information about trade routes, commercial networks, and regional politics. Egypt was not unknown to him. He would have understood something of its geography, its cities, its strategic position. Beyond these qualities, there is a deeper dimension to Umar's choice. Umar was not sentimental. He did not place men in positions of responsibility based on family connections or age. He placed them there because he believed they could accomplish the mission. That Umar believed Amr could not merely survive in Egypt but succeed suggests that Amr had convinced him the campaign was more than a suicidal gesture. The sources give us limited detail about the conversation between Umar and Amr regarding Egypt. We do not have their words. We cannot know their precise reasoning. But historians have observed that Amr made a request to Umar. Allow him to scout the situation in Egypt before committing to a full invasion. Umar agreed. This suggests Amr's approach was methodical, not reckless. He wanted to understand what he was facing before committing all his resources. This impulse, to gather information, to understand the situation, to avoid decisive action until the ground was truly understood, would define the entire campaign. The march into uncertainty. The Muslim army that crossed from Arabia into Egypt in 640 was not enormous. The exact numbers are impossible to establish with certainty. Various sources give figures ranging from 3,000 to 5,000 soldiers. No figure can be considered definitive. What matters is that the force was small relative to the territory being invaded and the strength of the opposition. The army was composed primarily of cavalry and infantry. It was equipped for mobility more than siege warfare. It was designed to move quickly across terrain. This tells us something important about Amr's strategic thinking. He was not planning to grind through a series of fortified positions in direct combat. He was planning to outmaneuver, to move strategically, to find weaknesses in the Byzantine defense. The journey itself was arduous. The desert between Arabia and Egypt is punishing terrain. It is not endless sand. Much of it is rocky desert, with complicated geography. Water is scarce. Supplies must be transported across distance. An army moving through this landscape is vulnerable. A smaller army is more vulnerable still. An army that loses its supply line ceases to be an army. Yet Amr pushed forward. The sources indicate that he was cautious but determined. He moved strategically, establishing supply depots, securing water sources, organizing his force for rapid movement. He was not rushing into battle. He was moving like a man executing a plan he had thought through carefully. The psychological pressure must have been extraordinary. An army is not simply a military force. It is a collection of men, and those men have families, fears, and doubts. Moving into enemy territory with limited numbers, depending on supply lines that could be cut, approaching fortifications designed to withstand exactly this kind of assault, this creates tremendous pressure. Yet, the army did not fracture. It did not collapse into mutiny or retreat. This suggests that Amr possessed whatever qualities inspire confidence in soldiers under stress. By the summer of 640, Amr's force had reached the vicinity of Babylon Fortress, a Byzantine military stronghold located south of modern Cairo. This was the moment when the theoretical campaign became a practical military reality. The fortress and the test. Babylon Fortress was not an enormous structure by the standards of medieval fortifications, but it was a serious military position. It was built on Roman principles, with strong walls, defensive positions, garrison quarters, and storage facilities. It was designed to resist exactly the kind of attack Amr was preparing to mount. It was held by a Byzantine garrison, soldiers trained in military discipline and equipped with the resources of a late imperial army.
For Amr, Babylon Fortress represented a critical test. If his small force could not overcome this fortress, the entire campaign would collapse. He could not outmaneuver it and continue into Egypt. The fortress would threaten his rear and cut his supply line. He could not bypass it. He had to take it. The sources describe the siege, but with varying levels of detail, and some accounts conflict. What does seem clear is that it was not a brief engagement. It extended over weeks. The fortress was defended with competence. The Byzantine garrison did not surrender immediately. They fought. Yet eventually, the fortress fell. Historians debate the exact circumstances. Some sources describe a negotiated surrender. Others suggest the walls were breached. Some accounts mention reinforcements arriving for Amr at critical moments. The precise details remain uncertain, which is exactly the kind of historical honesty this story demands. What matters strategically is this. Babylon Fortress demonstrated that Amr's force, despite being smaller than the Byzantine garrison, could overcome a fortified position. This was not a foregone conclusion. It was an achievement. It proved that Amr's strategy was more sophisticated than simple numbers suggested. After Babylon Fortress, Egypt was vulnerable. The major fortification had fallen. Byzantine military confidence was shaken. The question was no longer whether a small Muslim force could survive in Egypt. They had already proven they could fight. The question now was whether they could pursue their advantage toward the ultimate prize, Alexandria. The collapse of empire. What happened next was less dramatic than a grand battle, but more revealing about how empires actually fall. The Byzantine administration in Egypt began to fracture, not all at once, not with a single dramatic moment, but through a series of political calculations and retreats. Some Byzantine officials chose to negotiate with Amr rather than fight. Some garrisons, cut off from central command, chose to withdraw to stronger positions. Some local populations, who had complex relationships with Byzantine authority, chose accommodation over resistance. This pattern, the gradual breakdown of an imperial system facing a determined challenger, appears repeatedly in history. Empires do not always fall in dramatic final battles. They fall when the cost of maintaining control exceeds the perceived benefit. They fall when local administrators make individual calculations about surrender. They fall when the center loses the capacity to reinforce the periphery. By any rational measure, the Byzantine Empire in Egypt should have held. It had superior numbers in total military resources. It had fortifications. It had trained troops. It had the institutional machinery of a surviving empire. Yet against a smaller force led by a commander who understood strategy, politics, and human psychology, the Byzantine position disintegrated. This was not because Byzantine soldiers were cowards or their leaders incompetent. It was because Amr ibn al-As understood something crucial. Military victory and political control are not identical. You can fight and lose militarily. But if you understand the political system your opponent depends on, if you know how to navigate diplomacy alongside military pressure, if you recognize the moments when surrender makes rational sense to the other side, you can achieve political victory without defeating the enemy in a final, devastating battle. Alexandria, the final reckoning. Alexandria was the true prize. The city was not just militarily significant, it was symbolically enormous. It was the second city of the Byzantine Empire. It was a center of Christianity, containing major theological communities and ecclesiastical authority. It was a hub of Mediterranean trade. It was a symbol of imperial power. The sources suggest that Amr did not take Alexandria by immediate assault. Again, the exact circumstances are debated. Some accounts describe a siege lasting months. Others suggest the city was ransomed or negotiated into surrender. What is clear is that eventually, Alexandria fell to Amr's forces. When it did, something fundamental changed in the Mediterranean world. The Byzantine Empire lost control of Egypt. The Islamic State gained control of one of the wealthiest, most strategically important territories in existence. The balance of power in the Mediterranean shifted. This was not simply a military victory. It was a transformation of the political order.
Now, stepping back from the specific events of the campaign, we must ask a deeper question. What actually made Amr ibn al-As successful? It was not superior numbers. It was not overwhelming firepower. It was not divine intervention, though Islamic sources sometimes attribute outcomes to God's will. What Amr possessed was strategic intelligence. He understood that an army is not simply soldiers. It is logistics, supply chains, communication, morale, and political circumstance. He understood that a fortress is not invincible if the political will to defend it disintegrates. He understood that an empire can be defeated piece by piece through calculation and pressure without requiring a single apocalyptic battle. He also possessed what might be called political intelligence, the ability to read situations, to understand what options were available to his opponents, to recognize when they might be willing to negotiate or surrender. He appears to have been comfortable operating in ambiguous situations where the outcome was genuinely uncertain. This is a rare quality. Many commanders require clarity. Many require certainty before they act. Amr seemed comfortable with uncertainty. He did not require perfect information. He worked with what he had. There is another dimension to Amr's success that deserves mention.
adaptability in the face of contrary orders. According to some historical sources, Caliph Umar initially expressed hesitation about the campaign. At one point, sources suggest, Umar issued instructions for Amr to withdraw. Yet Amr, reading the military situation as favorable and believing the campaign could succeed, requested permission to continue. Umar agreed. This suggests that Amr had the confidence to present his case to the highest authority and the credibility that Umar trusted his judgment. This was not disobedience. It was informed persuasion. It was the ability to convince a powerful superior that the moment was right to push forward, despite risks. The transformation of an empire. Once Egypt was under Islamic control, the political landscape of the Mediterranean had fundamentally changed. Amr ibn al-As was appointed governor of Egypt. This was not merely administrative responsibility. It was immense power. The question of how Amr governed Egypt after its conquest is significant. Historical sources suggest that he was an effective administrator. He established a new administrative center at Fustat, a settlement south of Cairo that would become a major city. He organized the taxation system. He maintained order. He did not, according to the sources, engage in the kind of destructive governance that could have destabilized the territory. This matters because conquest and administration are different skills. Many brilliant commanders make poor governors. They understand warfare, but not the practical problems of maintaining control over a civilian population. Amr appears to have been competent at both. But Amr's later career also contained complications. He became wealthy. Some sources suggest his wealth eventually contributed to political difficulties. At various points in his life, he fell out of favor with different caliphs. He was sometimes removed from his position. He was sometimes recalled. His political fortunes rose and fell. This is important to remember when evaluating his historical significance. Amr ibn al-As was not a perfect figure. He was not a simple hero. He was a complex man whose achievements were real, but whose life also contained moral ambiguities and political failures. This makes him more historically interesting, not less. A perfect hero is less credible. A complex figure with genuine achievements alongside genuine failures is more true to how actual historical persons are constituted. The larger meaning. What does the conquest of Egypt by Amr ibn al-As actually represent in historical terms? On one level, it is straightforward. A young Islamic state conquered a strategically important Byzantine territory. The military balance in the Mediterranean shifted. The Islamic State gained access to Egypt's agricultural wealth and its strategic position. The Byzantine Empire lost a crucial province. This was the direct military-political consequence. But there was something larger here. In less than a century, Islam had gone from being a new religious movement in Arabia to being a power-controlling territory from the Arabian Peninsula through North Africa and into the Eastern Mediterranean. Part of this expansion was driven by military conquest, certainly, but it was also driven by political intelligence, adaptability, strategic thinking, and the capacity to recognize and exploit the weaknesses in the existing order.
Amr ibn al-As embodied these qualities. He was not the only factor in Islamic expansion, but he was a significant one. His conversion represented the integration of pre-Islamic Arab political intelligence into the Islamic State. His military campaigns and administrative skills showed that Islam was not simply a religious phenomenon. It was generating competent, adaptable leadership, capable of operating at the highest levels of ancient Mediterranean politics. The Byzantine Empire, which had survived for centuries despite enormous challenges, which had adapted to repeated crises, which had possessed the institutional machinery of an ancient empire. This empire was unable to hold Egypt against a smaller force led by a man who understood strategy and politics more deeply than they did. History does not allow us to conclude that everything in Amr's story was inevitable, or that the outcome was predetermined. The conquest of Egypt could have failed. Amr could have been defeated at Babylon Fortress. His supply line could have been cut. Reinforcements could have been too slow. Umar could have withdrawn support. The campaign could have collapsed at any of a dozen critical moments. That it did not collapse, that Amr succeeded, tells us something about contingency in history. It tells us that outcomes depend on individuals. They depend on strategic thinking. They depend on the ability to make correct decisions under uncertainty. They depend on political intelligence. Amr ibn al-As possessed these qualities. He was not the only reason Islam expanded into Egypt. He was not the only strategic mind in the early Islamic state. But he was consequential. He mattered. His actions changed the course of history. When we look back at Amr ibn al-As now, centuries later, the question is not whether he was a perfect man or whether his conquest was inevitable. The question is whether we can understand what he was: a man of genuine strategic intelligence, adaptability, and political acumen, who recognized opportunities that others did not, who pushed forward into situations where the outcome was genuinely uncertain, who understood that victory rarely comes from overwhelming force alone, but from the combination of military skill, political intelligence, and the capacity to read human situations accurately. He lived in one of history's great moments of transformation. He was not simply carried along by that transformation. He helped to direct it. In the end, the conquest of Egypt was not simply a military fact or a geographical fact. It was a statement about what was possible. It was evidence that the emerging Islamic civilization possessed not merely religious commitment, but also strategic capability. It demonstrated that old empires could be challenged and overcome by newer powers that understood strategy more deeply. 4 decades after the Prophet Muhammad's death, the Islamic State controlled Egypt. That did not happen by accident. That did not happen through simple, overwhelming force. That happened because a man named Amr ibn al-As understood something about strategy, politics, and the nature of power that his opponents did not. That understanding, in the end, was his greatest conquest.